Miles and I did our graduate studies together in acting, which I'm so grateful for, mostly because it was like 3 years of pranayama. It was like 3 years of
And rolling up and down your spine, getting articulate.
no wonder actors like doing yoga. Like when I polled originally the teachers that I was managing, when I moved to Vancouver, I ran a studio for a while, and I polled everybody, and I'm like, so where are you all from? And like everyone was an actor or a musician. They
Yeah.
seem to be very fields that feed into each other, and similar interests in the body and expression, and how we, I don't know, how we are embodied creatures.
And also you wanted to talk about sort of like the pitfalls of young teachers, and something that I experience or miss experiencing sometimes when I come into a young teacher's class is that there's a lack of rhythm and a lack of tempo, like the underlying bass kind of pulse of the class. And I'm not talking about speed, and I'm not talking about I'm not talking about speed. I'm talking about something deeper, like the overall kind of baseline of the class, the kind of like, like what's that called on the thing when you, the lifeline? What is it?
Oh yeah, like your heartbeat.
Yeah, like, like there's not, for me, great yoga classes have a kind of pulse. And it has to do with being able to cue the breath, and it has to do with being able to also move at a certain rhythm. And it can be fast and it can be slow. Within that, there are lots of dynamics. But I think something that young teachers don't realize is that at the baseline, there has to be that kind of heartbeat, that kind of pulse. And that makes it from being like this sort of island experience into being more of an event, where people are like, okay, I've experienced something meaningful. For me, that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I can feel that there's something about it, about the yoga practice, that I think when it's skillfully conducted, just to stick with our music metaphor, but there's a skillful conduction of that is more primal. It's not about, it's not even about like cueing or language, but it's about, there's almost a pacing to it that speaks to people's body.
Pacing, totally. Yeah.
So what would you suggest given that can be a pitfall, the disjointure of that, are there any suggestions that you would have for teachers who are on how they could do that more skillfully?
I think oftentimes, in my experience, when I teach like 300-hour trainings and stuff like that, something that people really get confused or kind of nodded on is the cueing of the breath. And I think regardless of whether students can follow the breath, whether they're at a level where they, as you get deeper into your practice, I think the breath gets easier. Because that's the first thing to go. If I've stopped practicing for a little while, my breath gets screwy, and then when I come back to it, the first thing that I have to really tackle is getting back on rhythm with it's almost like your circadian rhythm or something like that. But I think if they get more comfortable with cueing the breath with the movement, then there's always going to be a pacing. You know what I mean? And really leaving time for that breath instead of inhale, exhale, like inhale, arms up, exhale, arms down. If they can get kind of on that sort of pace, then even if they move slow or even if they move fast, there will still feel like there's a sutra, a thread throughout the class that's keeping the class, knitted. What do you think? What do you think in your experience makes a difference for that?
Yeah, well, I think it depends. I mean, some of the classes that I go to too, people don't cue breath at all. So it sort of depends on the style that the teacher is teaching. If it's a flow class, then I think trying to breathe with your class, or in a sense, like it does become like musical conducting, where you want to be with well, I think, maybe one of the things to do is like when you're just starting out is to understand that if you're trying to cue to the breath and create that kind of flow, just know that you're not going to be able to cue as much alignment, right? Like, so to take the pressure off of having to cue everything, if I'm going in and I'm going to teach a class which is breath focused, I will teach it differently than I teach a class where I'm teaching almost like an Iyengar style wall class where we're not focusing on the breath. So in that particular case, I have to know that if I'm going to cue to the breath experience, which I think is amazing, but I'm not going to be able to cue every little freaking alignment action because that's not really the point. So maybe first of all, let go of the need to do everything, because sometimes younger teachers feel like, oh my gosh, I need to do everything that I learned in teacher training. It's like, no, just
Yeah,
actually do the one thing well. And then as you cultivate that, then the other stuff, well, you can start to bring it in.
totally. I hear that. Do you think though that there's a way to do both? I mean, do you think it's either one or it's one or the other in your experience?
Or the other, either or. No, no, I do. I absolutely think you can do both. And so one of the techniques that I would use to do pacing and to do alignment is like to know when to cue the breath. So
Yeah,
when
totally.
when the most important parts are, right? So obviously sun salutations, flow. Like when I took your class too, you kind of broke it down. There was a time where you were giving instructions about how to do things, and then there were portions where it was like, now you kind of have the map. Now we're going to move through it in
Right.
a
So I
way.
think what we're coming to is when there's a little bit of flow, cueing the breath can be really instrumental to create a kind of a rhythm, for lack of, or a pacing.
Yeah.
And then, but then there can also be moments in the class when there's stillness, when they're hanging out, for example, in Warrior One or Warrior Two, and or any pose for that matter, where there's where you have a chunk of breaths that you're allocating to a specific form or a specific shape. And then in that time, it's a great time to finesse and to kind of give refined cues and to give more of, to get people more interested in what's happening in that shape or what could be happening in that shape.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's it. So and if you're doing a whole class, which is flow, then that's one thing. Most of the classes that I teach, we do have, it's almost like a wave where there's a wave of movement. And then there's the pause, like in Warrior
Yeah,
Two, where you can now get people more interested in their body. And then you pick them up back again into their breath in the transition and then move them through.
that's
So
kind of how I teach too. But I do think that there's also, because even if you're teaching like stillness, if you're teaching poses where you're teaching more of an Iyengar style where you stop, I do think it's important to remind people of the breath. But of course, because there's not the flow, you don't have to, it's not like you're going to be calling every single inhale and exhale, like they sometimes do in Ashtanga. But I think the reason why they do that in Ashtanga is because people memorize the sequence. So they don't actually have to call, the sequence is just, they're just calling the minimal part of the sequence. They're not actually, they're just calling it so it's not like people aren't listening for what's going to happen next. They know what's going to happen next. So there's,
it's different. Ashtanga is like, it's everything is about the breath, and the poses are just the scaffold that the breath moves through. And so
right,
it's all
right.
about, and the breath actually creates the alignment rather than alignment happening and then breath being part of it. So
Right, right, right.
I think it's like, I think as if for the new teachers out there, or even if you're a veteran teacher who's been playing with this, it's really fun to play with these dynamics and these elements of the practice. I mean, in my opinion, there's no right answer. It's like we have tools that we can use. You have the tool of the breath, you have the tool of your alignment, you have the transitions, and it's kind of like how you choose to pull up one tool in one particular class will make a certain kind of experience for your students. Like if I have a lot of breath and not a lot of alignment and a lot of flow, then it's going to create this kind of pranic, kind of river-like movement to the class. Whereas if I decide to take that down and I amp up the alignment, then we're going to have like the fire and the stability and kind of like it's almost like more of a mental class too. It'll be a little bit less in archetypally, this feels like less in the feminine and a little bit more in the masculine
Yeah,
quality of it.
totally. Yeah, and I think that knowing that you can manipulate those creates a great, like keeps you as a teacher interested and challenges you, and it also gives your students a nice broad spectrum, a completeness or like a wholeness, or makes them feel like you have a better command of things, because then it's kind of like mixing a salad. You can put more ingredients of this one time, but then if you really want to focus on the tiny little details, then you put more of this, and and then maybe like the next day you let go of that a little bit more so that they have a little more fun playing with it,
Yeah.
so that they don't get a chance to get bored, or you can still engage them.
Yeah, and I think it's, more about less a little bit about the boredom and more a little bit about they have the opportunity to experience all these different aspects that the practice can offer. Their own
Right.
stuff, their own flow, their own fierceness, and ability to hold and have stamina. So the tapas of the practice, so they get a little bit, they get to experience more range of who they are by more range of what the practice can give them, which is fun.
Right, right. And more range also, I think, makes gives you more space to add the philosophical elements when you need them, and more of the other seven limbs of the practice that sometimes don't get really mentioned in, because they can be interwoven, even if they're not spoken, they can be kind of interwoven into the the kind of ambiance of what you're setting up.
Yeah. So those things become, it's like they become woven in through the fabric of the class, through the,
Yes, because even if you're doing like what you were saying, like a breath-filled class, then you have, you can, that breath-filled class is probably going to have a higher like percentage or a higher sense of pratyahara at the end. So you can really play with that withdrawal of the senses, of that people like kind of coming in or cocooning into themselves. Yeah, I love that.
this is so fun. Well, we'll just wrap this up here, but this has been a really great explanation of just like one aspect of, as a teacher, how do you create pace and rhythm in your class, in a way that serves your students and creates a great practice, and the pitfalls of not doing that, and maybe some skills for how we can do it better. So,
Awesome. I love
yay!
you, Scott.
It's so good to talk to you.